In light of this conversation, you're clearly aware that somebody tampered with the ending of Mark's gospel. And I'm curious as to know why you continue to tell your Christian audiences that nobody tampered with the gospels. It seems to me that you have an ethical responsibility to edit your comments. Welcome to Briefing. Today I will provide evidence that 1. Jesus' resurrection is a legend. 2. Some of Jesus' own apostles did not believe in his resurrection. And 3. Detective J. Warner Wallace, the author of Cold Case Christianity, has not been particularly honest with his recent Christian audiences. Those are very big claims, and I'll need a lot of evidence to support them. That will be the topic for today's briefing training. An elementary understanding of the timeline of Jesus' life and the writings of Paul's epistles and the gospel stories would be helpful. For simplicity, I'll suggest Jesus lived in the first century between years 1 and 33, and Paul's epistles and the gospels were written between years 40 and the end of the first century. I realize these dates are in dispute. Generally, Christians will argue for earlier dates, and skeptics will argue for later dates. Tradition has Jesus being born in year 1 of the first century. His public ministry began around year 30 and his death by crucifixion around year 33. There is widespread scholarly agreement Paul's epistles are the closest writings to the events of Jesus' ministry, death, and alleged resurrection. After Paul's epistles are the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Again, there is widespread scholarly agreement Mark was written first. However, some scholars present plausible arguments Matthew was actually first. I believe this topic is in dispute. After Mark and Matthew's gospel, Luke wrote his gospel along with Acts of the Apostles, commonly called Acts. Then came John's gospel. What is not in dispute is someone added an ending to Mark's gospel that was not there prior. The evidence for the added ending is so strong that it is actually disclosed in your Bibles between verses 8 and 9. You'll see a disclaimer. There is a dispute about the date range this additional ending was in fact added. People would have been talking about Jesus' ministry immediately after it started. Just like people talking about a new pastor today. Oral traditions or discussions about Jesus continue to this very day, as clearly evidenced by me talking about Jesus right now. To build my case for a legend resurrection, let's take a look at the writings that are closest to the death of Jesus, Paul's epistles. From my perspective as a retired law enforcement supervisor, Paul is the closest thing we can actually call an eyewitness. Paul is an identifiable person, and he personally wrote about experiencing a resurrected Jesus in 1 Corinthians and also in Galatians. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Stronger evidence of Paul experiencing a post-mortem Jesus is found in the famous verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. They are routinely quoted by Detective Wallace and his cadre of celebrity apologists. Everybody talks about verses 1 through 8. I want to talk about verse 12 in the same set of passages. And he also appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. A few key points. Paul puts himself in the same witness context as Jesus' inner circle of apostles. Jesus appeared to the apostles, then Jesus appeared to me. The same context, writes Paul. A very vague, apparition-like appearance of post-mortem Jesus. Keep reading. There's important information that no one talks about in verse 12. Verse 12 is important. Paul is alluding to some members of the Corinthian church doubt his resurrection stories. Verses 12 through 19 are Paul's side of that argument against these Corinthian doubters. But if it has been preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. The laity of the Corinthian church had the opportunity to evaluate Paul personally. They were face to face with him. And apparently some of those Corinthians did not believe Paul's resurrection stories, and they argued about it. We are going to see that a lot of people did not believe the resurrection stories, and some of those people were Jesus' own inner circle of apostles. But what about the celebrity apologists prattling on about the impressive nature of Paul's 500 witnesses to Jesus' resurrection? Let's take a quick look at Catholic apologist Joe Heschmeyer's comments.
Includes both the death and resurrection of Jesus, but also that Jesus appeared, in his words, to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some had fallen asleep. Now, why does he mention that detail? Because, again, he's inviting you to fact check him. He's inviting the Corinthians to go explore, to see, okay, you claim there are hundreds of living witnesses to the resurrection. Where are they? And he can connect you. So this is really an invitation. This is kind of a shockingly large proclamation.
Could have checked it out. Has Joe Heschmeyer even looked at a map? The post-mortem resurrection appearances of Jesus took place in Jerusalem and or Galilee. Those locations are over 800 miles across the Mediterranean Sea from Corinth. On camelback, the trip would have been over 1,500 miles. For a Corinthian to check out Paul's vague claim of 500 witnesses would have been difficult and dangerous. But what if a Corinthian would have made the long journey to Jerusalem? What would they have found when they got there? They would have found the same thing that's found in Jerusalem today. Thousands of Israeli Jews who do not believe in Jesus and could care less.
The question of the day today is, have you ever read the New Testament, Brit HaChadashah?
No.
No?
First of all, it's a lovely day today.
It is.
There is a pride today
Yes.
in Tel Aviv.
Yes.
And I've never read that.
Can I ask why?
Why? Because I don't know. I read my lunch.
Oh, your lunch?
No, but it's okay. It's
Okay.
fine. I read the Bible, you know.
Oh, you did? You the Tanakh?
I read the Tanakh,
Yeah.
the Bible.
Yeah. What do you think about it?
The Tanakh?
Yeah.
See, we have learned that in school and read all the Bible, but
Yeah.
today I'm just going to synagogue and do my thing,
Yeah.
and that's it.
You have to believe yourself.
Yes.
I believe myself.
Yes.
I'm Jewish.
Yes.
And I don't believe on Jesus.
Yes.
I believe on God only.
Yeah. I believe in God too. Yeah.
But there is not intermediate between God and people.
There has always been.
No.
Always.
There is not one person.
Moses?
Is not.
The high priests?
But Moses is not the children of God. Jesus, he says that he is
The Son of God.
He's not the Son of God.
No.
Here is the error, is the problem.
Yeah, I'm cool.
Okay. So I'm a Jewish man.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe in Jesus. And am I wrong? And if I am, how or why?
God created the world, and you can tell that he did, because if you look around, you'll see.
It's beautiful.
And really look around. If you really look around, you'll see.
Thank you. Opinions, that's all. Like what's your opinion? You see a Jewish man standing in front of you. I say I believe in Jesus. How does that make you feel? And do you think that I'm wrong?
I mean, I have my opinion. You have your.
And your
own
opinion is valid and
Yeah.
completely respectable.
As well. So as well.
Thank you.
If you ask me, like, if we would have a debate, I wouldn't know much.
Yeah.
But if you would have a debate with a rabbi
Yeah.
that knows, I think
Yeah,
we would
yeah.
have great fun.
You read the New Testament and you said no. Do you know what it's about?
What?
The New Testament, Brit HaChadashah.
It's talking on Jesus.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it talks about Jesus and Yeshua and his purpose for coming.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and do you know what his purpose is for coming to earth?
earth. Maybe it's just to make one more religion, one more, arguments, one more.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
The religion is destroy the world. I believe that all the people in the world equal.
Yeah.
Everybody, we have 2 legs,
I agree.
2 arms, 1 head,
We all
one
want.
heart.
Yes.
Come on, stop it. But it's separate. Us.
Yeah. You know what? I think.
One braggadocious extremist like Paul claiming that there are 500 witnesses does not actually mean there are 500 witnesses. We do not have any ancient writings from anyone claiming to be of 500 witnesses from Paul in a large group. Mark's original gospel without the forged ending does not provide any witnesses to a resurrected Jesus. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome arrive at Jesus' tomb and find his body missing. The tomb is not actually empty. There's a young man in there dressed in white who tells the women Jesus has risen and will meet the apostles in Galilee. Then, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and they fled the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Another early and vague reference to a resurrected Jesus with no witnesses and no details. The forged ending of Mark's gospel produces witnesses to a resurrected Jesus. It is vague who these witnesses are. Their identities are not clearly explained, with the exception of Mary Magdalene. Jesus first appears to Mary Magdalene, who goes and tells the others, but they don't believe her. Then Jesus appears to 2 of them who are walking in the countryside. Those 2 go and report it to the rest, who don't believe them. Then Jesus appears to the 11 while they're eating a meal, and he rebukes them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe prior reports of his resurrection. There is starting to become evidence of a struggle between believers in the resurrection and non-believers. The exact formula for one side to start exaggerating to convince the other. Early Gospel of Matthew produces 13 witnesses to a resurrected Jesus. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary go to Jesus' tomb and they find it open. An angel is there and tells them that Jesus has risen from the dead and will meet the apostles later in Galilee. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary leave to go inform the apostles. And on their journey, they meet a resurrected Jesus. They recognize him and they worship him. The other apostles later go to Galilee and they personally listen to Jesus' Great Commission speech. Celebrity apologists twist themselves into knots trying to explain away what verse 17 actually says. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. We are left with an early account of a risen Jesus appearing before his inner circle of apostles, but some of those apostles doubted it. Let's hear what Catholic apologist Joe Heschmeyer has to say.
Most of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, he takes people by surprise. They're in a locked room. He just shows up. They're walking on the road to Emmaus. He just shows up. They're, going away from the tomb. He just shows up. Whatever it is. But there's one appearance where he says, go and tell the apostles that I go before you to Galilee. So the Galilee appearance, which seems to be the appearance described at the end of Matthew's gospel, is an appearance that he seems to invite a crowd for. That's probably the appearance in which he appears to 500 brethren at one time. And it also makes sense of a particular part where it says that the apostles believed and some doubted. Well, how could they believe and some doubted? Are we saying the apostles doubted? That seems like a stretch even for the apostles. As much as they'd struggled, you would think by this point, after they've seen Jesus numerous times, they wouldn't still be doubting. But if the Galilee appearance is a public one, and you've got both the really hardcore followers of Jesus, but also people who are just kind of idly curious, that makes sense. This actually does a really good job of synthesizing the evidence.
Heschmeyer is dealing with information that refutes his deeply held resurrection belief. Without hesitation, he makes something up to explain away what Matthew actually wrote. There is not a hint in Matthew's gospel that anyone was there with the exception of the 11 remaining apostles. This is a classic example of cognitive dissonance. Heschmeyer hears something that he doesn't like, and it causes mild mental anxiety, which he instinctively wants to relieve. He makes something up to relieve that anxiety. Luke's gospel, written after Paul, Mark, and Matthew, depicts women going to the tomb and finding it empty. There's two men there dressed in gleaming white who tell the women that Jesus is not there and he is risen. The women return to the apostles and inform them what happened at the tomb, but the apostles do not believe the women. Peter, however, goes to the tomb and finds it empty. No one sees a risen Jesus. Later, two of Jesus' disciples, Cleopas and probably his son Simon, are walking on the road to Emmaus when they meet a stranger. They have a conversation about all the things that have been going on in Jerusalem concerning Jesus. At dinner that evening, they recognize that the stranger is himself Jesus, and then Jesus disappears. Cleopas and his son return to Jerusalem and inform the apostles of what happened. And then Luke writes this. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they had saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why did doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he did this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Luke's story depicts apparition-like appearances of Jesus, and now for the first time on our timeline, we have a flesh and bone appearance of Jesus in front of his own disciples. It seems that Jesus has to put some effort into getting them to believe that it's really him. "Hey, it's me! Touch me and see!" And even after he does that, some of them seem to be having trouble believing it. Luke then ends his gospel with an apparition-like disappearance. Jesus ascends into heaven and poof, he's gone. There are fair questions to ask. Is Luke adding legendary enhancements to build a better story? Was there people present at the time who did not believe the resurrection stories? Are some of those people Jesus' inner circle of apostles and disciples? Would an ancient debate between believers and non-believers motivate Luke to exaggerate his stories? In Acts of the Apostles, also written by Luke, the legendary improvements to the story continue. After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave them many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. Acts removes all references to doubters. Jesus is now giving many convincing proofs to his apostles that he is alive and visiting with them over a 40-day period of time. Acts adds another legendary enhancement to the story. After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. Is Luke writing this to combat oral traditions that, hey, nobody saw any of this? No. They saw it with their very eyes, and then a cloud hid him from their sight. John's gospel is the last writings in our timeline. The witness identification is completely convoluted and difficult to decipher. But Mary Magdalene goes to Jesus' tomb and finds it empty. She reports that to Peter and the other apostles. Peter and the other apostle literally race each other to Jesus' tomb. They go inside and they immediately believe. They believe based on the empty tomb. No one has seen a risen Jesus. Then Jesus appears personally to Mary Magdalene. She returns to the apostles and tells them, "I have seen the Lord." Jesus then appears to all of his apostles and they are overwhelmed with joy upon seeing the Lord. All references to doubt have been completely removed from these portions of the story. John's story does something absolutely brilliant with oral traditions of doubts amongst Jesus' inner circle of apostles. John blames all of the doubting on one guy, the famous story of doubting Thomas. Thomas is missing from Jesus' resurrected appearance in front of the apostles, and when the apostles tell Thomas about it, he responds with, "I refuse to believe it until I see it myself." Then the story says this: a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out and put your hand into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas then becomes a believer. But the story raises an interesting question. If Thomas refused to believe in the resurrection until he personally saw Jesus, why should anyone else? The timeline of the writings of Paul, Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and John depict a struggle getting people to believe that Jesus was alive after his crucifixion. The timeline starts with apparition-like appearances that do not have witnesses, or the witnesses are shadowy. The timeline ends with specific people seeing things with their very eyes and being ordered by Jesus to stop doubting and believe. This is evidence that the stories were improved over time. Evidence of a legendary resurrection. There were people refuting the resurrection of Jesus at the time. So many, in fact, that the pseudonymous author of 2 Peter had to write a response. For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. Someone accused the apostles of following cleverly devised stories. Those ancient skeptics were spot on accurate. Detective Wallace and his cadre of celebrity apologists claim that the book of Acts is historically reliable. I believe that the book of Acts is filled with absurd legends. Let's take a quick look at a few examples. In Acts chapter 19, there is a wild story. Paul is touching handkerchiefs and aprons, which are then used to heal the sick and conduct exorcisms. Some Jews are so impressed with Paul's exorcisms that they attempt to do the same magic on a demon-possessed man, but it didn't work. The demon-possessed man gave their priest and themselves such a beating that they were forced to run out of the house naked and bleeding. Naked? Were they naked before the beating? Were they naked because of the beating? Why are they naked? In Acts chapter 20, Paul is giving a long sermon where a young man named Eutychus falls asleep and tumbles out of a window to his death. Paul runs downstairs, jumps on top of Eutychus, and brings him back to life. Paul personally wrote about himself being imprisoned, stoned, and beaten with metal rods. I do find it reasonable that a provocateur like Paul would have been harassed and beaten up by the religious elite of his time. However, the book of Acts exaggerates these points to ridicule. In Acts chapter 14, Paul is stoned nearly to death in the city of Lystra. His unconscious body is then dragged to the village edge and he's left there for dead. The apostles miraculously heal Paul from his injuries and he's able to travel 50 miles to Derbe the very following day. In Acts chapter 13, Paul is in a heated argument with the sorcerer Elymas. Paul uses sorcery to blind Elymas, causing him to grope around in the dark looking for a guide. In Acts chapter 5, Peter now is able to heal sick people simply by walking down the street and touching them with his shadow. In Acts chapter 9, Peter raises a dead disciple named Tabitha back to life in a story that's eerily similar to Jesus raising Jairus' daughter back to life. These stories are entertaining for sure, and they paint Peter and Paul as comic book superheroes. But read them yourselves and ask, is this legendary fiction or is it reliable history? Detective Wallace routinely uses a law enforcement anecdote about a bullet casing to describe how nobody tampered with the gospel stories. In spring of 2022, Detective Wallace had an extended conversation with his son, police officer Jimmy Wallace, about the added ending to Mark's gospel, and they both acknowledged that somebody had tampered with it.
Welcome to this edition of the Cold Case Christianity Broadcast. I'm Jimmy Wallace.
And I'm Jay Warner Wallace. We're talking about today something that I think a lot of Christians don't even know, although it is kind of marked out and delineated in the scriptures, and that is the ending to the Gospel of Mark. I think it raises questions for a number of reasons we'll talk about today, but one of them is I just don't think that, look, in my Bible, I'm reading the ESV or the NASB, it's clearly marked out. You know, there's usually a gap in this text, and it'll say that this is not in the earliest manuscripts, and it comes in right after the initial description of the resurrection. The expanded details of what happens next are not in the Gospel's earliest manuscripts. So the question then becomes, you know, is this an added story? Does this demonstrate, for example, that the resurrection is a late fiction that's added to the story? So that's really the question under consideration.
Let's take a look at what Detective Wallace continues to put on his website since the conversation with his son and acknowledging the tampered ending of Mark's gospel. All right, here's coldcasechristianity.com. We're going down to the videos and evidence the Bible is correct. A video with a date of September 25th, 2023, which is after Detective Wallace's conversation with his son. And let's see what he has to say. Fast forwarding to the critical part.
None of those.
And here we go.
We opened a case. We had no physical evidence, not a single picture of the crime scene because he had moved. We never worked it as a homicide. It was a missing persons case. Without a single piece of physical evidence, they convicted this guy in 4 hours. 4 hours. Keith Morrison said, this is the one case, Jim, I don't believe you got right. No one believed it. He confessed, though, at sentencing. So we know he's the killer. And the reason why we convicted him was because he changed his story over time. He had one story in 81. He had one story in 86. He had one story in 96. He had one story in 2012, one story in 2014. You change your story over time, adding details that didn't exist prior, you're probably lying to me.
Detective Wallace continues to use the compromised bullet casing argument in front of the sheeple of his Christian audiences. He was an invited speaker to the Reality Student Apologetics Conference recorded at Cottonwood Creek Christian Church in Allen, Texas in February of 2023. Let's take a listen to what Detective Wallace told these Texan school students.
It happens in criminal scenes, right? We have a crime scene and we go to a courtroom years later. And I'm going to put a piece of evidence in the crime scene for you. See that casing? I'm going to bring that casing into trial 30 years later. I'm going to tell the jury that that casing has an extractor pin mark on it, and that extractor pin mark matches the extractor pin in the handgun of the defendant. So I'm going to use that extractor pin mark to identify that casing from the crime scene to the suspect's pistol. Now, I think you could fairly ask, well, how do I know that that was really there in the beginning? Maybe it was collected, and then some point later, some lying detective etched in the extractor pin mark on the casing so it looks like it belongs to the handgun, and then carefully puts it back in property, and now we have a bad piece of evidence. The people who come along behind him, they don't know that it's been tampered with. They investigate it as if it's true. By the time I get it, I don't know that it's been changed.
Does Detective Wallace have an ethical responsibility to edit his bullet casing argument since acknowledging that somebody had tampered with the ending of Mark's gospel? Detective Wallace, I formally invite you to engage in a public debate about your continued use of your claims that nobody tampered with the gospel stories, and I look forward to your public explanation. I believe that there is strong evidence that the story of Jesus' resurrection started with oral traditions and were then written down with a demonstrable timeline of legendary enhancements. I encourage you to study these verses and my comments for yourselves and make your own decisions. Thank you so much for your time for watching. Best regards and stay safe.